Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Harris, and I am honored to serve as the Associate Dean of Clinical and Experiential Programs here at UDC Law. I direct our Immigration and Human Rights Clinic, and this is the third event in the Conversation with Clinicians series this semester. We have had some fantastic conversations over the past year, and they are available on our website. Conversations with Clinicians features UDC Law clinicians in conversation with leaders in the experiential education field. As early leaders here at UDC and our predecessor law schools in clinical legal education, at a school where our students take between 10 to 14 mandatory clinic credits as a graduation requirement, we are seeking to create a space where clinicians across the country and indeed the world can engage in topics of interest, along with thinking through some of the most pressing issues facing our community. Typically, we have cameras off until the end, and then you are welcome to join us in the final 15 minutes on screen or unmute yourself and ask questions. So today, I am thrilled to be joined by my colleague, Professor Sakinah Tillman, who directs our tax clinic, in conversation with Professor or Dean Tameka Lester of Georgia State University College of Law. I will introduce both Professor Tillman and Dean Lester, and then I'll hand it over to Professor Tillman to facilitate the conversation. Professor Tillman joined us in fall 2022 to direct the tax clinic, where students represent low-income DC and DC area residents in tax controversies with the US government. Her research focuses on tax administration, tax policy, and poverty law. Prior to joining us at UDC, Professor Tillman was a clinical fellow at the University of Baltimore School of Law Low-Income Taxpayers Clinic. And in practice before entering academia, she worked with several tax law firms where she represented clients in matters before the IRS. Her work really extends outside the university to various local and national organizations. She is immediate past president of the Monumental City Bar Association for Baltimore City. Currently, she's a board member of the Monumental City Bar Association Foundation. She also serves as secretary for the Washington Bar Association and member at large for the Tax Council section of the Maryland State Bar Association. She is a native of Philadelphia and an Eagles fan. She graduated from Bloomsburg University for undergrad, and from Western Michigan University Cooley Law School with her JD, and the University of Baltimore School of Law with her Master's of Law in Taxation. So Professor Tillman will be in conversation with Professor and Dean Tameka Lester, who is the Associate Director of the Philip C. Cook Low-Income Taxpayer Clinic at her university. She currently serves as the Associate Dean for Student Success Programs and Strategic Enrollment Management, and plays various other leadership roles on campus. But her work too extends outside the university to various local and national organizations. She's a member of the Herzing University Legal Studies Program Advisory Board and the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Advisory Board, housed at the United Way of Greater Atlanta. She's also a member of Atlanta Bar Association's tax section and the American Bar Association section on taxation's publication committee. And she serves as the co-chair for the AALS Law School section on clinical legal education's Clinicians of Color committee. Her scholarship and written works have been published in the Atlanta Lawyer, The Conversation, Procedurally Taxing, the ABA Tax Times, and Time magazines. She speaks across the country to various groups about taxpayer rights and responsibilities, as well as issues of tax policy, but more specifically, how tax-related issues affect marginalized communities and communities of color. As a fun fact, in 2017, Dean Lester served as an expert witness for the late Georgia Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis on a hearing before the House of Representatives Ways and Means Subcommittee on Oversight, titled The Taxpayer Experience with the IRS. She is a native of South Carolina who graduated from Winthrop University with her bachelor's degree, from the University of Phoenix with a master's in business administration, and from North Carolina Central University School of Law with her JD. So without further ado, I will thank both of our speakers for being here with us today, and I will hand it over to Professor Tillman. I'll hop back at the end in the final couple of minutes and tell you about our final event of the semester. And thank you all for being with us today.
So I have a few questions and I'm going to ask you. So let me start with the first question. After reading your bio, you have so many amazing, accomplishments. So I just want to talk about your path to law teaching. whether you wanted to be a clinical professor, or was this an unplanned progression in your career? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So this was definitely an unplanned kind of detour on my career plan. But when I look back at everything I had kind of done before getting to clinical teaching, both my educational experience and my professional experience, I see that all of that really lent itself really well to being a clinical professor and really running a clinical program. As Dean Harris said, I have an undergraduate major degree, in integrated marketing communications. I have a master's degree in business administration. And before going to law school, my professional experience was really in marketing, communications, training and development, process improvement, kind of project management, primarily in the banking industry. And so then I get the bright idea that I want to go to law school too. And so in law school, I really fell in love with tax law. I took all the tax courses that my school had to offer. So I took basic tax, advanced tax, corporate tax, partnership tax, estate and gift tax. And then I also worked at the low income taxpayer clinic in our community, which was at the legal aid organization at the time. And so after graduating, my school received the low income taxpayer clinic grant from the IRS. And so I was able to really just kind of transition into this work and then later into a faculty position here at GSU. So definitely not planned, but definitely glad that, I kind of landed in this area.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So you talked about, you landed that position now as a faculty at the tax clinic. So can you share about your experience running the tax clinic at Central?
Sure. As I said, and as Dean Harris indicated, North Carolina Central, I'm a proud legal eagle. It was my alma mater. And at Central, they really have an extensive clinical program, very much like UDC, where at the time, I think we had 12 different clinical programs. And so really extensive offerings, really kind of like the crown jewel of the law school. And my longtime mentor, which she actually just passed away about a month and a half ago, her name was Pamela Glean, and she was the Associate Dean for Clinical Programs and Experiential Education at the time. And she helped them to secure the grant to start the tax clinic. And so they had a faculty member at the time who had worked for the Office of Chief Counsel, had extensive controversy experience, but she was running another clinical program. She was running a community development clinic. And so she was willing to kind of help them get off the ground, teach the course, the seminar course, help to build that out. But they really wanted someone, and this is actually it was pretty insightful of Pam to think this. And she was like, while we have someone who has this subject matter expertise, it would be really great to have someone who knows how to build a business. And based on my experience in corporate America, also my educational experience with getting an MBA, I really knew how to do that. And so I remember being in the interview and saying, this is actually my dream job. It combines all of my past experiences in marketing and business, now my love for tax, and really my desire to help others and mentor other people. And so I worked as a clinical director in that program for 4 years. I learned a tremendous amount from both Pam, the other clinicians, and was able to really get it off the ground and really build something really great there. I taught the seminar course, I taught advanced tax, I taught legal writing, and began really kind of getting my feet wet with presenting locally to organizations in the community, and then really serving the institution on an as-needed basis with different initiatives. And so when the opportunity arose at Georgia State, I had always really admired the clinic here at Georgia State. I seen that, really looked at them as a model for clinical education. Their website was one that I used as a practicing lawyer all the time because it had such extensive information at the time. And so really kind of jumped at the opportunity to take what I had learned at a smaller program and join a much more established program at GSU.
Awesome. So I want to follow up to your this question about running the tax clinic at Central. And so how was it creating a new tax clinic? Because I know that takes work, considering that I was a fellow prior to being in this role as a director, but I'm grateful that I had the fellowship experience because I was able to use some of the material that I had and just make various edits. So that was easy for me to be in this position, but you didn't have that somewhere. You had the experience at the legal aid, but tell me more about how was that really starting that clinic from scratch?
Yeah, it was an interesting experience. But because there really was nothing. There wasn't a filing system. There was no education and outreach kind of initiative that was already in place. There were really not really any clients or any mechanism for attracting clients. And so I did have the good fortune of having this person who worked at the IRS. And so she was able to teach a seminar course the first time around, and I was able to sit in the class and learned a lot by watching her teach and watching her interact with the students. But that also gave me about a semester to build out everything else. And so I spent a lot of time just going and building relationships in the community. And whenever I talk to clinicians, I used to teach new director training for the LITC community. And that's one of the things I always tell people, you know, in the beginning, when you don't have clients, this is a wonderful opportunity to start building your relationships in the community, you know, so that when people run into issues, they think of you and think of the clinic. And not only that, but see you as a resource for educational seminars or for educational and outreach events so that you can really build these partnerships. And so I spent a lot of time really doing that, in addition to building kind of the nuts and bolts of any firm, right? And also building recognition, not only within the law school, but in the community about the clinic and attracting students, really kind of getting student buy-in as to why this would be a great opportunity for them and the things that I thought they would learn in the clinic. And so it really was a tremendous opportunity for me, but also it gave me an opportunity to really build something from scratch that was really meaningful for the students and provided them with some additional opportunities.
Okay, thank you. And so on the first question, you talked about your path to law teaching and how you took various tax courses. You realized, I love tax. But as you know, as a tax professor, you know that we have students in our clinic that not so much love tax.
Right.
And so can you talk about how do you get students interested in tax if they're not naturally inclined? Like, how was that experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the great thing at my first institution was that tax was required. So you can always lobby for it to be required. And that does make it a bit easier because you have a captive audience. But at Georgia State, it's not required. And so one of the things I always try to communicate to students is my enthusiasm around tax. And I really talk about what drew me to the field and what made it appealing for me. First, I try to appeal to their individual interests, right? And discuss personal implications. And one of the things I say is that most of an individual's decisions have tax-related consequences, right? Are you going to rent or buy a home? Are you going to be an employer, an independent contractor, or self-employed and start a business? What type of income are you going to have? Are you going to invest? Are you going to pay your student loans or defer them? Are you going to sell or exchange property? All of these things are common individual financial decisions, and they all have tax implications. And so I think it's important that people have some working knowledge, just probably for their own personal edification, right, about what these tax implications are. But then more importantly, as an attorney, I always kind of challenge my students in the beginning to say, you know, give me an area of law you think that has no tax implications, right? Tax intersects with pretty much everything. When I worked in North Carolina, individuals that had certain criminal charges around drugs had imputed income that had tax consequences, you know, whether it's family law or a business or corporate practice area, all of these things have tax implications. And so while when I was in law school and I took basic federal income tax, our professor would always call it the tax tingle. He was like, some of you guys are going to get the tax tingle, and I got it, right? And I recognize that not everybody's going to get the tax tingle, but I do think it's important as attorneys that you understand what tax-related consequences look like and when they arise, so that you know when to get a tax attorney or a professional involved. So that's usually the way I kind of approach it to get some buy-in.
I love the term tax tingle. I never heard of that. I got the tax tingle my second year in law school, and I took federal income tax.
Me too.
I realized that was what I wanted to do moving forward. So my goal is now moving forward, I'm going to use that term in my clinic. Hopefully they get the tax tingle.
Yes, that's what you want.
And so thank you. So, you know, you talked about your path to law teaching, and then how you were the director of the tax clinic at Central. But now you hold an administrative position at your current law school as Associate Dean for Student Success Programs and Strategic Enrollment and Management. So can you talk about that transition from being a director to the tax clinic? Now you're in this administrative role. Can you talk about that transition, and can you tell us what this new role entails?
Everything, Professor Tillman.
Okay.
It's probably easier to tell you what it doesn't entail. No, seriously. So this new role really involves student affairs, and then it oversees pretty much every department that interfaces with students during their legal education. So I always tell people it's from admissions to admission, right? Admissions into the law school through admission to the bar. And so I oversee, in addition to student affairs, admissions, career services, academic success, and bar prep. And I really do enjoy it a lot. You know, it's crazy. I was probably about, I don't know, maybe a year before I ended up in this role, I was talking to my clinic director, Ted Afield. He's now our Associate Dean of Experiential Education here. And he was like, you know, what's kind of next? What are you thinking about? Do you think you want to stay in the clinic? Do you think you want to do something else? And I said, you know, I think I wouldn't mind being Dean of Students. He said, really? And fast forward, the opportunity presented itself because we had a lot of transition happening at the law school. We ended up getting a new dean, and kind of with the new dean comes a lot of shuffling around in the administrative suite. And we ended up with a totally new administrative team. So a new dean of academic affairs, a new dean of finance, and a new dean of students. And so our previous dean of students left the university for another institution in a different type of role. And so our dean basically approached the faculty and said, is there anyone who might be interested in doing this on an interim basis? And so I said, sure, because I really do think that our jobs as clinical professors, again, really lends itself well to working with students in this way and engaging with students in the various kind of ways they intersect with my office. And so, you know, we're constantly recruiting students. And so that recruitment skill set lends itself well to admissions. We're always giving career advice, right? Talking about jobs, talking about potential jobs, talking about resumes and cover letters and CVs and those kinds of things. And so that really does help when we start talking about career services and professional development. Because of the intimate nature in clinics, we end up talking to students a lot that are in crisis or as they deal with various issues in their life. And then also from an academic perspective, you know, they naturally come to us and say, well, you know, what classes do you think I should take? Or how can I be more successful in this regard? And so student advisement, that's just kind of a natural part of the job. And then finally, bar prep. I think it's a thing that people don't think about being strengthened through clinical programs, but I really think it is because you start talking to students not only about the substantive knowledge that they're building, but also the soft skills and how those things prepare them for the practice of law. And so you start seeing kind of this intersection of disciplines, intersection of practice areas in a way that they don't see in their doctrinal courses, right? If I take torts, I know I'm in the torts book and I know there are only a few chapters I can possibly be in, right? If I'm in property, same thing. But once you step into the clinical world, you're stepping into true practice. And so my client doesn't come in and say, I have a tort, and it may be intentional in nature, right? You know, they don't do that. They come in and give you a lot of information, some that's relevant, some that's not relevant, some that's tax related, some that's not. And so building those skills around issue spotting, around client counseling, I think all of those things are really good for the bar exam, but also as we start looking to next gen are going to be even more helpful.
Yes. And so I wanted to follow up. You explain your job, how your new position, how it's pretty much working with admission to the bar. And you talked about how, you know, you help students with selecting various classes. So are you helping them select classes that will help them prepare for the bar, or you're helping them select classes that they may have some type of interest in?
Both, actually. And sometimes students come to you and they say, you know what, I'm interested in something more transactional. What are some good classes for me to take? Or am I going to fulfill my requirements? Or if I want to do this, what classes should I take around this? Or is this going to be helpful? So those things are definitely conversations that we have. but also particularly students who may have had a more difficult first year, more challenging first year. They say, you know what, I want to make sure I pass the bar exam. And so what are some classes that really can begin preparing me for the bar now so that it's not such a heavy lift? Because what we see is that students really do kind of need to be at a certain point skill wise and almost substantively when they begin bar prep in order to kind of get over the hump. And so making sure that they're at that point, whether it's from a soft skill perspective, a writing perspective, a knowledge perspective, is helpful. And so we're able to talk about those things more proactively while they're in law school versus reactively once we're already done and in bar prep, thinking of different strategies then.
Okay. And I appreciate your comment about how clinics can help students with bar passage, especially as it relates to the next gen bar that's approaching soon. And you talked about how the clinics can really help students with issue spotting. And we have some clinicians on here, and this is something my faculty talked about, like how can clinics be of support? How can the faculty be of support? But from a clinicianal standpoint, what type of tips do you think will be helpful for clinicians to really help their students with passing the bar or help them get prepared for the bar? I know I always tell students that when I even tutor students for the bar, I will always ask them, hey, do you know that we're in contracts land? Do you know that we're in torts land? Right? Because when a client walks to your office, you don't know. But if you are in a torts class, you know that you're going to talk about intentional torts. You know you're going to talk about negligence. So can you give us some type of tips you think that clinicians can use, or even just even doctrinal professors can use to pretty much help with the bar passage as it relates to issue spotting? This can apply to clinical professors, or even doctrinal professors.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about how we do it in the clinical realm for sure. And I think that one of the things that I constantly try to reinforce with students is kind of this breaking down of silos, right? And showing them how once you get into practice, you don't operate in those silos like you said anymore, but rather you start seeing a blending of practice areas. So an example I like to give my students is a CDP hearing, for example. I'm like, we have a CDP hearing because someone has a lien or a levy by the government. Why? It's a government taking. They're entitled to certain due process, assurances. That's constitutional law. That's not tax law, right? Now, once we start talking about, we talk about priority, we talk about security interests, it's all kinds of things that are kind of wrapped up in this one concept. And so a lot of times I will talk to them about that so they can the light bulb can kind of go off and say, oh, wow, right. Yeah, I do kind of see the blending of these things now. If we're talking about someone who has a business and they're having an issue with deductions or substantiating deductions, it gives us an opportunity to talk about business formation and what that means in these different kinds of concepts. And so I like to point that out to students oftentimes to show them that this is a really different ball game. And I think that's helpful because I do think that helps to build their confidence. So much of what we see at the bar exam with people not passing is confidence in your soft skills, confidence in your ability to be a self-regulated learner, confidence in your ability to be successful. And so I think that kind of stuff is important. I also think that just the natural rhythm, if you will, of clinic helps to build analytical skills because they're kind of forced to think on their feet. When we do case rounds, their classmates, their colleagues are asking them questions. When we're in supervision, I'm asking them questions. And a lot of times they don't get a time to really deliberate on that a lot. And so their analytical skills are getting built during that. Also, again, to your point, it strengthens their issue spotting skills. And then I think most importantly, it really gives us an opportunity, particularly when we start preparing for hearings, when we're in tax court, to really do some targeted improvement on their writing. And I think that really helps when we start talking about, I know Georgia, we have the MPT. And so there's a drafting portion to the bar exam that really requires them to shift their thinking from being a student to being a lawyer, right? They get all the material, they get all the case law, all the cases, and their job is to take a position and write a memo or draft a will, and to do that in a way that a lawyer would do it, to show off their lawyering skills. And so I think that in clinic, we start that process with them, or we reinforce that process with them, that this is how, as an attorney, you should be writing, and we give them a lot of feedback. In the tax clinic here at Georgia State, we, because, we have 3 attorneys in the clinic, every writing that goes out the door is looked at by all of us. So when I was in the clinic, Ted would take the first, Dean Ayfield would take the first kind of stab at the writing. He's looking at it for litigation value, to make sure it's a cohesive argument, to make sure that we haven't missed anything. The student gets feedback from him. Then they go back, they work on it some more, and then went to our supervising attorney. She would then look at it for grammar, flow, to make sure that they were hitting all the points of the argument, those kinds of things, and to make sure they've incorporated all the things that Dean Ayfield said they incorporate. Then, as the person who signed everything going out the door, then I would look at it again to make sure all of those things were incorporated, to make sure we hadn't missed anything, to provide the student with more feedback. And now I'm looking at documentation. And so that kind of intensive feedback around writing really is a game changer for our students. And I think is one of the things that we do really well in clinic to help move the needle in that regard.
Thank you. Some of my students will say, Professor, I think you're a harsh grader when it comes to writing. And I would tell them that my goal is to make you better. And what I have found is that the students know the law, just like most students are sitting for the bar, but it's just the application. And so I will ask them questions and say, well, hey, you know this issue, but let's marry the facts and the law together so we can have a solid analysis. And after I meet with them one-on-one, because it's just me teaching in our clinic, they understand a lot better and it's helpful for them. So I appreciate your comments to that. And so I want to shift gears somewhat. And so you teach clinic classes outside of clinic too, including tax and tax policy. Can you talk about how your work in clinic influenced the way you teach at non-clinical classes?
Yeah, I would definitely say, and I think my students would attest to this too, even my podium classes, I teach them like a practitioner. Because that's the hat I normally am wearing. And so in every class I teach, I really do try to, as much as I can, teach it from a practical perspective. And so for example, basic federal tax, I'm always doing shameless plugs for the clinic, of course. And then when I talk about a particular topic, if we've encountered it in the clinic, I talk about that. Sometimes I will invite students in from our clinical program, if there are students in the class who are also enrolled in the clinic, I will call on them sometimes and put them on the spot to talk about things. But probably the thing I do the most in basic text too is at the end of each chapter, I use Burke and Friel, and so, it has code sections identified, regulations, cases, but it's a problem-based book, which I enjoy because it's more like a simulation situation at that point. But at the end of each chapter, what I also do is I talk about practical implications. So an example would be, let's say I'm talking about section 162, business expenses and capitalization 263. And I talk about that from a business perspective, right? There's certain things that a business owner will be able to write off immediately. There's certain things that have to be capitalized, and we'll talk about that. And so then at the end of the chapter, I'll say, okay, as a business owner, how do they translate that to the government, right? They do it on their tax return. So if it's a sole proprietor, it's a Schedule C, and I kind of show them what that looks like. It's a 1065 if they're a partnership, 1120 if they're a corporation. And so I show them what those forms look like and show them how a business owner would translate that information to the government. And then I say, okay, well, what if the government doesn't agree? Or they have questions, right? Because when you file a tax return, you're kind of on an honor system. So what happens next? And what happens next is an audit. And so I talk with them through, if a person is audited, this is the way that we'll tag that. We'll ask for documentation. We will do a memorandum because we're lawyers, right? That's the way we like to communicate. And in that, we will outline the Black letter law, 162 of the Internal Revenue Code. We will talk about regulations that are directly on point. And then we will show and prove. We'll show them our documentation in the form of exhibits. And so I really try to tie that together for them in each chapter so that they can really get a feel for what that feels like in real practice.
Okay, thank you. So we're coming to an end. So I just want to, just briefly wrap up what we discussed so far. So you talked about your path to legal teaching, and then you talked about how you got this position as a clinical professor, now as the administrator, as an associate dean. And you talked about how clinics, how they can support academic success and bar passage. And now you talked about your experience with teaching outside the clinic. But I want to shift gears to talk about your leadership roles.
Mhm.
And so you have various leadership roles. And so you're deeply engaged internationally in tax law and in clinical education. Can you talk a little bit about your role as the co-chair for American Association of Law School section on clinical legal education for Clinicians of Color Committee? What are some of your goals in that capacity?
Yeah, I know that's a mouthful, right? But the AALS is really a fantastic organization. Very much like the ABA, it has sections, and it's really designed to support academics, support the institution, support individuals, to kind of, encourage, collegiality, networking, and different things like that amongst the academy. And so in this particular role as co-chair of the Clinicians of Color, which I actually just rolled off, I've done it for 6 years, which I enjoyed immensely. Because really my goal as co-chair was really to support clinicians of color in the legal academy. And as you know, and probably some of the people on this call know, clinicians really do receive varying levels of support, and resources and status in the academy. And I had been really, really fortunate that at both of the institutions I had worked at, I was always well supported, well mentored, well resourced, but we know that's really not the case at a lot of places. And so in my leadership position there, my goal was always just to provide a safe space for clinicians of color to be able to get the support they needed, whether that was advice, whether that was mentorship, whatever that was, to provide a space for that. In addition to that, what we started doing was we started doing some targeted programming. So we did a mentorship program. We did a program to help people who were going on the market. So maybe they were coming out of fellowships and going into permanent positions. So helping them prepare for that. Also helping them to look at their scholarship, both in traditional and non-traditional ways. So really trying to, mentor, sponsor, help people in these roles throughout the academy. And it was so well received that we started doing half-day retreats. We started doing social events. We did programming throughout the year. And I think most importantly, we really encouraged the use of a listserv that you could join as a member of the community. And so I again, really just love that position because I grew a lot, by helping others. I definitely got to know a lot of people in the legal academy that way. And it really did, as I was putting together these programs and sponsoring these programs, again, it helped me to learn a lot about the different issues that people were facing across the academy in different places. So I really enjoyed it a lot.
Well, thank you for that. And so the last question that I have, how do you think about the role of identity as a part of being a clinical teacher?
Yeah. So you mean how I identify as a clinician or how I identify as a Black woman in the academy, or tell me a little bit more.
You can actually talk about both. That would be great.
Yeah. Definitely as a clinician, I know that I have a different perspective probably than some of my doctrinal colleagues sometimes. And so I think it's a perspective that, needs to be considered. It needs to be heard. It needs to be offered whenever we're making decisions, the importance of experiential education and being really an advocate for that. I sit on CLIA's board of directors, and I literally was on a call earlier today where we were talking about the importance of experiential education and how we have this 6-hour requirement now, but it really needs to be more. And people, the institutions like UDC, you guys are doing more, other institutions are doing more, but it really kind of needs to be a mandate. And so my identity as a clinician is always to advocate for experiential opportunities. I think it's so important that students, alums are practice ready and ready to hit the ground running. And we know that this profession is a difficult one. And like clinicians in the academy, new associates or new lawyers receive varying degrees of training and mentorship and development. And so really advocating that they get as much experiential exposure while they're in law school is important to me. As a African-American female. I love being in this field because I feel like it helps to, one, diversify the profession, right? But it also helps other people see themselves as being a part of this field too, right? And so I had a student tell me that one time. She was like, I never thought about tax, but I interacted with you as a professor. I thought I would really enjoy your class. And now she's a tax lawyer, And so I think that representation, again, is so important. And so having minorities, whether it's women, people of color, in non-traditional spaces, I think is important from a representation perspective and also from a recruitment perspective, so that people have people they feel like they can identify with, to talk to, and to have as mentors in this space.
Thank you. And I agree, especially as my role of identity as a clinical professor is to really stress the importance of clinical teaching and clinical learning. And I noticed that about a few weeks ago, I was looking at some of the students' resumes, and most of them don't even have job experience. So the clinic is their first experience. And they are nervous. They are nervous to even network with someone that can possibly give them some type of opportunity. Their biggest concern is confidence. They're not sure if they're confident enough to get that first job. And I always tell them that you have to start somewhere. But in this role, I tell them all the time that I am teaching you how to practice. This is different than your doctrinal courses because you are learning the Black letter law, and you're learning it for 10 weeks, 15 weeks, however long your semester is, and you're preparing for one exam. But your professors in your doctrinal courses, they don't see the soft skills that you're developing throughout the semester. I'm able to see these skills on a consistent basis. I'm able to see how you're able to articulate your words. I'm able to see how you're able to write. I'm able to edit your work on a consistent basis, which your doctrinal professors don't do because they're only looking at one exam at the end of the semester. But I'm teaching you how to advocate on behalf of your clients and also encourage you along the way. The students in clinic, they are excited for clinic. They're just scared because tax is something new. They never experienced it before, but I'll also give them encouragement along the way. And so as I am teaching them in this role, I'm also encouraging them. I have positive affirmations that I prepared, and it's uploaded on our Blackboard. So when students are discouraged about a case because it's too difficult, I'll tell them, hey, did you read the positive affirmation? And so in this role, I'm not only just advocating for clinical teaching, clinical learning, but also being an advocate for my students and encouraging them. You'd be surprised that students now, considering that mental health is very prevalent, a lot of students suffer with depression, stress, and various other mental health issues. And so we don't know that. But sometimes if you really pay attention, you can see some of the signs, because I'm an advocate for mental health. And so not only just that, just really encourage them to just be their very best. And you'd be surprised that I get emails all the time like, Professor, I felt seen. And it just shows me that I'm doing more than just being a professor, but I'm showing them that I'm a human being. And I'm also showing that they're a human being too.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think from a professional identity perspective, I think that's tremendous, right? I think that's so important because those are the skills, that self-awareness. How do I want to show up as a professional? How do I prioritize my mental health? Those are things that a lot of times we don't even think about, but that kind of get baked into the sauce of clinic because it is such an intimate relationship. We do get to know our students in a much more intimate and close way than I do my students in my podium class. I might have 50 people in basic tax. I'm supervising 6 people in clinic, and so those 6 people I get to know really well. And the relationship just is different. And I'm able to your point, work on different things, different skills, different pressure points with them that other professors simply aren't able to do because they don't see it.
Right. And I can agree with your role as it relates to being a Black woman in the legal academy. I shared this with a colleague that I didn't know that being a professor was possible. And when I was in law school, I had 3 Black professors, and I just had no idea how to even get into the legal academy. I was a math tutor in college. math tutor in law school, and I love the idea of teaching. And I guess that's from being the eldest of my mother's children. So I always was that teacher, but I just didn't know how to get there. And then once the fellowship position became available to me, I realized, hey, there is another way to get into this if you didn't know about the napped up, the normal way, the actual way that most professors get into the legal academy. But when my students see me, they see me as, oh, I can be that too. And last semester, one of my students shared with me that I was their first Black professor.
Wow.
And that made me feel good. And, you know, when students come to me like, you know what, you're a Black professor, I can relate to you. And now that I teach at an HBCU, the students gravitate to me and say, hey, professor, I may not have your class, but I heard about you.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's this idea because I'm young, they gravitate to me even more.
Right.
But it's just this idea. And I tell students when they come into my office and they talk about various areas of law that they're interested in, I always tell them like, hey, I love that. You should pursue that. But there's another opportunity too. You can also be a law school professor as well. But that conversation, I never had that conversation when I was in law school. It was more so, hey, if you're interested in tax, you should pursue an LM in taxation. Right. But no one in law school never told me that, hey, you too can be a law school professor. Mm-hmm. And so now I'm that voice now advocating for people to get into a legal academy and letting them know that although I love private practice, this job as a law school teacher is so rewarding and it doesn't feel like work. No. And I'm just so excited just to be here. I can't see myself leaving. This is something that I want to do until I retire. And so I'm just grateful now that I'm in the space to really tell students that this opportunity is possible. If no one never told you, it is possible to be a professor.
Yep. That's absolutely true.
You. I love that. I love the accountability too. That's a big tool that I use as well. So I just want to thank both of you, amazing women, scholars, teachers, clinicians, leaders here for joining us for this hour on a Friday. And yeah, just so appreciate the insight that you both have shared. I want to make sure we respect people's time and let folks hop off if they need to. We did record eventually today's conversation, at least the part that really mattered, which was Professors Tillman and Lester engaging, and we'll make it available on our website. I just want to share with you our final conversation that we will have this semester, and I'll paste the link to register into the chat. That is going to be on Friday, March 17th, a little bit of a different time, so it starts at 12:30 instead of 12. And Professor Jerome Hughes, who I think is with us right now, but he directs our Community Development Law Clinic, will be in conversation with Professor Renee Hatcher from the University of Illinois, Chicago Law, and with Professor Carmen Huertas Noble from CUNY Law. So it will be a kind of three-way conversation thinking about a lot of issues around community development clinics specifically, but hope you can all join us again then. And thank you again to Professors Tillman